Judith is a multimedia creator, author, and translator. Her first novel, Sophia and the Utopia Machine, which you'll be hearing from today, was shortlisted for the EBFP in 2017 and the Singapore Book Awards in 2019. Judith, take it away.
Thank you, Elaine. So I'm going to read from Sophia and the Utopia Machine today, and I'm going to read from the portion where Sophia is actually activating the Utopia Machine and creating a new universe in her mother's Biopolis lab in Singapore. And it's basically setting off the Big Bang. Okay, so here goes. Darkness and silence, darker and quieter than anything on earth. Sophia's feet stood on nothing. Her hands held nothing, yet she did not fall, suspended somehow by herself. She couldn't see her body, yet she knew it was there. Sophia found she was holding her breath, that everything felt like it was holding its breath. Even though the darkness and silence were absolute and ancient, it all shivered with anticipation. It was waiting for something to happen. It was waiting for her. Somehow, she knew what she must do. Slowly, experimentally, she breathed out. Something glowed. It was her breath, or perhaps it came out of her breath. It was a thing where no thing had been before. It was a tiny thing at first, like the dim spook of a firefly glimpsed as a reflection on the water. But then it grew. It took her breath away. It escaped her as she tried to reach for it and skittered above something. It was reflected in something, though nothing had been there before. Then, suddenly, it burst. It displayed something huge, a plosive so large that sound was too slow to capture it. Sophia shut her eyes as the light washed over her. All at once, it rushed out in every direction, and she was sure of it. She heard the mad rush of music, a chorus that elaborated on the tune she had sung. And the universe, for that is what it was filled with things. She was not sure what to call them. Had she been a more sentimental type, she might have called them angels. But one thing was for sure, they were composed of matter. They bumped into her, a caterwauling bunch of things spinning and wheeling about in a state that could only be called joy. She felt them to be facets of herself, reflecting and bouncing off her, and at the same time, she felt them to be quite independent entities. Though they bumped into her, it was a pleasant sensation, and each bump seemed somehow to communicate a tune into her heart, so that when they all added up in the musical staff of her mind, it made a weird and wonderful polyphony that she was somehow unconsciously composing. The universe had not stopped growing. It was spewing things now like an exuberant baby, flinging sparks that flew out into the darkness and illuminated it. Never had Sophia been so afraid of stars. The crazy things were blooming and whirling all about her, and they were simultaneously huge and small to her, towering like giants and sparking like pinwheels as they whooshed outwards. The angels, it seemed, were drawing them this way and the other, seeming to squabble over where to place each one. Sophia found herself both impossibly small and implausibly large, depending on what she touched. She took one of the wheeling things gently and spun it on her finger. The angels gathered around to watch. It was a minuscule galaxy, and as Sophia flipped it around her fingers like a coin, it seemed to gain velocity and shine. "I shall name this one mine," said Sophia, her soul overwhelmed by its beauty. And when she said those words, the galaxy seemed to be filled suddenly with orbs, like tiny jewels that sang with new songs. And when Sophia heard these, memories of the suns and planets and creatures and beings and molecules and atoms and quarks and shivers filled her to her fingertips. She remembered the way they were, and so they were. And every bond sang its own peculiar pitch, lacing in and upon itself, tunneling infinitely through and before and beyond her nostrils and straight through to her heart. And she smelled the most exquisite of perfumes. And amidst the drinking in of all the cacophony of the angels, Sophia stopped in shock and saw herself. She did not look like her nearly 15-year-old self. Yet it was unmistakably her. She was seeing her above time. And so what she saw was a kind of creature whom she recognized as herself on a planet that looked exquisite and not unlike her Earth, but only it was dark amethyst and deep emerald. The woman who was her had limbs and a face that extended eternally time-wise, so she appeared both constantly moving and eternally still. Multiple versions of her seemed to merge into each other, stretching forward and backward in time, like the many folds of an accordion. And she was beautiful and powerful and terrifying to behold. And when this Sophia saw her watching her, she looked straight back in her eyes. A brief smile lifted the corners of her mouth, and her eyes lit up excitedly. Milton, she mouthed, though Sophia couldn't hear her, and it was as though she were talking to someone just over her shoulder, though Sophia could see no one there. In an instant, Sophia witnessed the forming of the crust, the roiling of the gas clouds that parted to reveal the new Earth's fresh new face. The planet turned, rolling lazily on its back like a giant whale. Sophia loved it. She willed herself down into it. She wanted to walk its mountains, to walk its paths. She wanted to splash down on its oceans, to play with its creatures, to soar on its winds. Everything she saw, she illuminated with her gaze, and so for a space she closed her eyes and imagined herself falling softly, softly into the deep emerald of an old forest. Sophia stared. She didn't know how or why, but she knew who was standing before her. It was the form he took that was so surprising. Before her, tall and majestic, in the middle of the dark rainforest, was a magnificent orange and black Malayan tiger. They stood and looked at each other for a moment, neither moving a hair. Milton? She ventured shyly. The tiger stared back at her with fiery eyes and seemed to nod imperceptibly. Sophia, you have come. He didn't speak exactly. She was not sure if he emitted any sound. Yet Sophia heard the deep baritone in her mind and understood. You brought me here? The forest around her was thick with moisture, but cool from the dark green canopy. Unseen creatures scuttled in the underbrush. Again, the tiger lowered his head in acknowledgement. Its features seemed to soften. My Sophia, he said. The words were deep and tender. Sophia felt them in her bones, and somehow her fear gave way to wonder. She inched forward towards him before thinking it through and reached her hand out to touch his golden flank. He didn't feel like an avatar at all. This was flesh she touched, underneath the rough fur. She inhaled the scent of the deep, lush rainforest, and suddenly something overwhelmed her, like a wave engulfing the shore. She knew him. It wasn't a first meeting at all. It wasn't a second or a third or a fifth either. It was as though she had carried him within her somehow all her life. A strange bird called in the air. There are things you need to see, said Milton, his eyes flashing. Show me, said Sophia. That's it. Thank you. And I'm going to put the link to my work right there. And I'll be giving away a preview of the book. So do enter your email for this stuff. Thank you.